David, I am so happy you agreed to do it again.
The sequel.
The sequel. So I will be basically asking you the questions on the basis of the time I spent with you in between. And the first thing will be about Beckett. Why Beckett? Why in Ukraine? Why now? And why you think at all he is important, and some ignorant people like me, for example, have to go and Google and understand who he is.
Well, I don't think any writer is essential, first of all. I mean, not even great national writers. I mean, writers are writers. They matter to you if they matter to you. They don't have to. It's not school. So, I mean, I guess there are two ways of answering that question. The first is, why not? He's a great writer. Why shouldn't he have a life in Ukraine more than the very small life he had, I think, in the 90s when there were a couple of productions of his plays? My involvement with Beckett personally is twofold. One, I met him a few times in Paris when I was young. I was taken to see him. It's not as if he were a friend, but he was a friend of a great friend and kind of intellectual mentor of mine who knew him well and who used to take me now and again to have a drink with him. He certainly was Irish in that way. And the second thing is my mother did a famous production, infamous production, I don't know, depending on who you talk to, of Waiting for Godot, of Beckett's play Waiting for Godot in Sarajevo during the siege. And I wasn't part of the production, although I saw it. But it's more waiting, if there's relevance to Ukraine beyond just the fact that he's a great writer, and there are lots of cultivated people in this country, and that will be, he's of interest, I would imagine, or could be of interest if he were translated properly. But this play has a sort of history of a relationship to war and to faith and to, it's basically, the premise is, it comes out of, Beckett was in the French resistance during the Second World War. He was an Irish citizen, so as such he was a neutral and he could stay in Paris during the German occupation between, what was it, 1940 and 1944. And Beckett was part of the resistance. And the play, the most conventional interpretation of the play, or anyway, the place people start, is that it's two guys in the resistance who are waiting for a third guy, Godot, who never shows up. And in the case of a place that's besieged, either literally like Sarajevo was in between 92 and 95, or in the sense of at existential risk, as this country of course is, it's waiting for the intervention, waiting for the victory, waiting for something that you hope will come, but you don't know. There's also the element of waiting for God. Godot, he didn't, despite the fact that he later denied it, he didn't choose the name Godot by accident, even though he once said, if I meant to write God, I'd have written God, not Godot. But he was kind of being a little disingenuous. So I thought the play was relevant. And then my friends, Roman Veritelnik, who runs the literature department at Kiev Mohyla Academy, and his partner, Halia Stefanova, an actress who did some Beckett, were interested in my talking about it. And since my policy in Ukraine is I do anything anyone asks me, which is not my policy anywhere else, to put it mildly, because there was a, how should I put this? Charity, no, why don't I just put it the way I feel like putting it? I don't have to do these things anymore. But in Ukraine, I don't go on panels, I don't go on television, I don't talk about my mother publicly, I don't. I should have a card printed up and put on my, on my Twitter feed or something. But in Ukraine, I pretty much do anything anyone asks me to do. And they, Roman and Halia wanted me to talk about Beckett, so we went to a theater and we talked about Beckett, and then she read one of the famous monologues of one of the characters, Lucky, which is maybe the best known, which I believe they had translated into Ukrainian many years ago when they tried to put together a production. And it still may happen. As for me, well, I love Beckett, but I love him. I love lots of things about Beckett, not just this play. He's the best kind of person in despair, a cheerful person in despair. It seems very inelegant to be a gloomy person in despair. That's kind of boring. But to be a person who sees the humor in the horror. He once wrote, "Birth was the death of it," which gives you some idea of sort of, and another famous line is, "Fail again, fail better." And his novels, there's a publisher here who's recently did a Ukrainian translation of a novel of his called What. And I think there are other bits of him in print in Ukrainian, but of course, you know, as so often the case in this country, the problem is that so much of what was translated for the cultured classes, even in the first 10 years after independence, was in Russian. And so there's a lot of catching up to do, obviously, and I mean, everything exists in Russian. It'd be nice if everything existed in Ukrainian. It's possible that I've been here for about 6 weeks, and I'm going, unfortunately, on Friday, but I'll be back in January, both to teach at Kiev Mohila, teach a class at Kiev Mohila, and do some workshops, and also a project about memory in the Bikivnia forest. But I might try to do something about Beckett in some context, but that's not clear yet.
Remember the moment when your intellectual mentor took you first drinking with him? What was it like?
He was very elegant, courtly, Irish, more Irish than I thought he was going to be. I mean, he was a strange kind of Irish person. First of all, he was a Protestant, not a Catholic, and a Protestant from the Republic. So that's, in terms of history and sociology, that's quite significant in the Irish context. But look, I just wanted to listen. I could just as happily have been the proverbial fly on the wall. I didn't really have to be there. I hardly asked him anything. He asked me a couple of questions. He liked sport. So he asked me something about American sport, I remember. But it was just listening to these two people. It was Beckett and a Romanian writer who, like Beckett, changed languages. Beckett began at a certain point to abandon English and wrote in French, although he translated a lot of his books back into English. And they're somewhat different. And Emil Cioran, as it would be pronounced in Romania, was a Romanian writer of the extreme right as a young man who sort of abandoned his politics and became another one of these pessimists. Although perhaps a bit less cheerful, he tended to recommend suicide, which Beckett would have thought was a waste of time, that it would come soon enough, so don't worry about it. But I greatly admired him, and he also switched to writing in French when he came to Paris. I think during the war years, also during the German occupation. But of course, he was a Romanian national, which meant he would have been an ally of the Germans.
Speaking about Bukivna and memory, why you think it is important for Ukraine? And what touched you about it?
Well, I'm starting to feel as if Bikibnia is my orphan child. It's extremely weird. I never thought this would happen. I knew nothing about Bikibnia. I mean, I knew some Ukrainian history before I started to come here, and some Ukrainian history, and some Ukrainian cultural history before I came here in April of 22. But obviously didn't know much, certainly didn't know enough. I'm not sure I know enough now, although I know a fair bit more. In fact, I'm sure I don't know enough. And I'd never heard of Bikibnia. And I had been, and I must have been coming here, it must have been my third or fourth time. And I was driving with the people from Penn, Ukraine, with Volodya Yermolenko and Tetiana Ogarkova to Kharkiv, I believe. Well, anyway, we were on one of these Penn trips where they bring vehicles to the soldiers and they bring books to the libraries, other bomb shelters and other places. And they've let me tag along a few times to various places, and including, we were in Kherson together twice, I believe. And they mentioned the forest in passing, that there was this place where there were these graves where the NKVD had buried in unmarked graves the 30,000 people they shot down in that headquarters where the SBU is now. And I sort of took a note of it. And I'd been to Babyn Yar and to Bucha quite soon after my arrival. I think I went to Bucha the first time I was here. And I went to Babyn Yar the second or third time I was here. But it interested me. And then finally, again, thanks to these friends of mine, Roman Vertelnik and Halia Stefanova, I expressed some interest in going, and they arranged for a friend of theirs to drive us all out there. This would have been about 8 months ago, I guess. And first of all, it struck me that the place was completely ignored. There's no sign. You have to kind of know where it is, or you have to drive very slowly in the right lane, and look out the window all the time, because there's not even a sign. And the road, it's near Brovary. I'm not sure exactly where, but it's on one of those big roads where there's signs for petrol stations, for food, for you name it, all kinds of advertising. And what would it cost? 1,000 euros to put up a sign for this incredible monument to Ukrainian martyrdom? But nobody seems to care. In fact, the only people who seem to care are the Poles, a lot of Poles were apparently killed in that period in the late 30s here in Kyiv. And the Poles paid for part of the monument and still keep up their part. But I was amazed by how little people cared about it. Most of my friends here, I'm talking about Ukrainian friends, not Western friends. Most of my Ukrainian friends had never been, and a few of them had to have their memory jogged as to what it is. I mean, of course, they knew once you reminded them, and so I just was very both moved by it, because it's a very moving place and the monument is good. Unlike, if I'm being honest, Babyn Yar, which I think is, in terms of a memorial, not a success. Let me put it very mildly. So I got interested, but people said, "Oh yeah, I'm meaning to go," or "I never been," or "What was that again?" And then, "Oh yeah." And so it brings up all kinds of issues about what's remembered, even in the context of historical memory that's useful to a country, a memory culture. And after all, this is a culture this country is full of memorials, and it's full of streets being renamed after Ukrainian heroes or cultural figures instead of the Russian ones whose names were there until pretty recently in many places, apparently, I'm told. And so you say to yourself, well, why is this one not remembered? In the context of a positive memory. I mean, we're not talking about a statue to Petliura, a figure of considerable controversy, and also who would also, if you made a big statue in, I don't know, Rivne to Petliura, you'd have a lot of angry Polish people just for openers. But there's no ambiguity about the moral, there's no moral ambiguity to the Bukivnia Forest. It's a place of martyrdom, a place where people were, buried after having been murdered without, anything, with these fake trials. And so I'm interested it does interest me to know why nobody cares about that place, but people care about other places. Again, I'm not talking about Bucha or Izium. I mean, of course, you care about what's happening now. That's obvious. But why does why is there's so little attention paid, and that interests me. I'm not sure I'll ever find out an explanation. I mean, I could make a whole case for it. The rebels of the 60s discovered it, and people like Stus, who were in Ukrainian culture thought of as heroic figures, were interested in it. But as far as I can tell, this one got left behind. And I don't know why, in fact. So I'm sort of, I like sort of strange, improbable causes. So I'm interested in the forest, and I will try to arrange. I'm participating in a conference. They're doing a website now, which is Bukivnia, Vavinyar, and Bucha, and a whole complicated website with biographies of victims and also biographies of perpetrators, which in some ways is probably more interesting in historical terms. So that's a sort of as much of an answer as I can come up with.
When I was going to interview you a second time, my friends were kind of saying, ask him about values, because we feel that there are no values anymore, that it's empty kind of word. So ask him what he thinks about values.
I think they're a good idea. Well, of course, look, it's very important not to look at the past with rose-colored glasses. Were there values in Soviet Ukraine? Were there values in the Ukraine of the oligarchs of the 1990s and the beginning of the new century? Were there? I mean, we tend to, every generation that's in trouble, at risk, thinks, well, maybe things were better before. And the answer is they were better for some and not better for others. I mean, in terms of dead people, the past is certainly not superior to the present. So, I mean, what were the values of the places we're talking about? Including people who are admired. I mean, one of the things that's happening in the United States at the moment is that all these people we and most people until quite recently grew up thinking were really perfect heroes, you know, all the terrible things they had. You know, Thomas Jefferson, one of the principal founders of the American Republic, was a slave owner. Lincoln was very good about black people, not so good about Native Americans. He hung a whole bunch of them at one point in his career. You know, if you actually look at even the most heroic figures, you are likely to find, maybe there's some exceptions you could come up with, but you're likely to find things that don't conform to the values that this person is supposed to exemplify. So, look, I understand if the question's about values, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I don't believe in progress narratives. I don't think Martin Luther King said the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I see no reason to believe that. I tend to have a much more classical Greek view, which is cycles, and, you know, expresses itself later in conservative philosophers like Spengler in Germany. I think you just, you know, empires rise and fall, and societies, you know, shine and then collapse, and that's the way it is, in my view. So, you know, if someone's saying, well, we had all these values and suddenly they were interrupted, I get a little nervous and think, I don't know that that's true. Having said that, we have expectations. It was not unreasonable to think in 1992 that there would never be another major war in Europe. I'm not talking about the collapse of Yugoslavia, but when the Soviet Union collapsed without a huge amount of bloodshed. I mean, there was some, but compared to what could have happened, it was very little. I think a lot of very smart, decent people thought there may be wars in the rest of the world, but Europe's pretty much done. Europe, including the former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact countries. Now, Ukraine has proven us all wrong. It turns out it's not true. And now, what those of us like me who never believed this stuff, I mean, I can prove it with my own writings. I always thought this, you know, this world of human rights and was never gonna last. But, and I always thought war would make a comeback, as they say. Like a, you know, war. And, you know, obviously we're speaking after Iranian missiles have landed in Tel Aviv, and so it's not only here, it looks like the world is going back to the way it was before 1945, which was, nobody thought. Before 1945, for basically all of human history, there was a war every 30 years, big war, in Europe and also in most other places, I think. So I don't know what it means to talk about values. I think that history has I don't believe history's on anybody's side. I don't think history's a person with opinions. I think that the societies we make are what we make of them. You know, this society, surely, for all its faults, is a better society than you had in the 90s. If only because there's more civil society. Whether it'll win or not, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, what do I know? But, you know, at least you have, you know, you have counterbalances to these post-Soviet kleptocratic times. You also have a kind of national consolidation that certainly wasn't inevitable. The bitter truth is, part of the reason you have that is Vladimir Putin. He kind of, his monstrous war forced consolidation because you had to defend yourself. And you couldn't afford divisions. I mean, I'm well aware, don't get me wrong, I know this place well enough after 2.5 years to know how many divisions there really are. My crystal ball broke long ago and I never owned a pair of rose-colored glasses. So, I get it. But still, the fact that the language issue has such a different weight now in the East and the South, all these things, but there's no inevitability. In a sense, history is what we make it in each generation, in each time. And, that's, unfortunately, I think that's closer to the truth, and we can't know the outcome. In a sense, we have to, coming back to Beckett, one of Beckett's most famous lines is, "Can't go on, must go on." And maybe that's a better way of thinking about it than worrying about where values went.
Individual values, personal. How you define, for example, this is my person, this is not my person?
Oh gosh, it's above my pay grade.
You can always refuse.
No, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the answer to that is I think more, I think a lot of people, maybe not, certainly not all people, but a lot of people are trying to be decent people and trying to live, relatively honorable lives, knowing full well we're all going to do terrible things. And, we all have, the great Colombian writer Garcia Marquez said, you have a public life, a private life, and a secret life, and God only knows what happens in your secret life. So, you don't want to go investigate that too much, but I don't know, you try as best you can. The problem is that we in Europe and North America and several other parts of the world, a lot of Latin America too, we don't live in Christian societies anymore. I mean, they don't have authority the way they do. Even for people who go to church, I mean, there tends to be what we call in the United States cafeteria Catholics, by which they mean you pick and choose your dogmas, like in a cafeteria. I mean, in an age before the collapse of faith, or anyway, the collapse of Christian faith, that was one way to order your values. You said, well, it says in the Bible, you shouldn't do X and Y. And you tried to, and you should do A and B. And I think a lot of people tried to do that. Now you have to improvise, and that's not easy. And I think part of the craziness of our times, all the gender bending stuff, all these kind of fantasies of self-invention that you see in Western Europe and North America, and again, also parts of Latin America as well. I think, I don't much care for the manifestations, to be honest, to put it mildly. In fact, I've written a savage book, come out in a couple of months in the US and the UK about woke, and a sort of attack on woke and all of the identitarian politics. But to be fair, what people are doing is groping for new hierarchies of value and identity. And maybe they're not doing it very well, and maybe some of the ways they're doing it is totally ridiculous. But one understands the impulse very well. Because people can't live without, I don't know if people can't live without values. people can't live without the illusion that they have values. Let's put it that way.
What were you doing in the Literature Museum? They couldn't come that day.
Oh, the Literature Museum. Well, again, as I say, I mean, I'm, you know, I mean, there is a sense in which I'm like a fairly cheap escort. You know, I go where, you know, I'm asked to go. But I don't even charge like even a cheap escort.
I know.
But no, that's not, that wouldn't be right. Speaking of values. They asked me to talk about the museum and memory and work, because for about the last 12 years, I guess, I've been working on issues of collective memory and its relation to history. And so obviously, of course, Ukraine, you know, that's, for me, a very important thing that I connect to, that I'm interested in when I'm here. All these memory wars that you've had, and you're still having to some extent, even in the, you know, what do you think about, what do you do with, which heroes are still important? Because obviously some have fallen by the wayside. You know, I don't think you're going to get too many Ukrainians to have a big argument about Mazepa. But Bandera, yes. And so, I mean, you know, the memories also are transformed in every generation. And because memories are not history, they're made out of history, but they're not history because they're not critical usually. They're either the memory of the devil or the memory of the hero. But you know, people are rarely one thing. And also, of course, you know, as you know from the recent dust up with the Poles about the massacre, even an incredibly pro-Ukrainian government can't afford not to be very tough on that subject. And you, in turn, will have, presumably, those demands, you know, 30 years from now, and whatever, you know, I mean, I mean, I don't know that, again, I'm not trying to do predictions, but imagine for the sake of argument that Russia broke up and a decent government came to Belarus. Well, you'd be arguing with a lot of stuff because they wouldn't agree with you about everything or you about them, and you might say, unless you acknowledge X or Y, you know, we're not going to be on such good terms, as the Poles were saying to you about 43, is it? I can't remember the year. And so, I mean, this place, you know, these are all questions. A lot of them will have to wait till the war is over. You can't be expected to do this now because it's also too painful. You know, it's fine to demythologize your heroes when you're at peace. It's not such a great idea for anybody when you're at war, particularly when it's a war of survival, as this war is. This is, you know, you're fighting for your lives, and among other things, your cultural life. So anyway, the Museum of Literature, they asked me to come and talk. I have no idea if what I said was of any use to anybody, but that's usually my reaction after I try to present something and hope it finds other people as it leaves me. Let's put it that way.
You said they are looking for illusions of values and new identity and hierarchy. I suddenly remembered the debate which I had with my father, because I, as a kid of 90s, was always very romantic about things like Godfather and all this kind of things, about an individual and his friends who are building, everything around them. And my father was very much strongly against it and about the society who has to support everybody. Is this debate still relevant, or it's totally irrelevant now? Is it still a romanticized part for a lot of people? Things like, I don't know, Godfather, the book or the movie.
Well, in the U.S. and in North America and many other places, it's so deeply ingrained in the culture, that film. I mean, it's such a term of reference, even today, I think, so many decades after it came out, that I think it probably is relevant. Whether that's a good thing or not is another question. Whether the story of a bunch of, basically gangsters should be the thing that's romanticized. Well, you could argue that one.
But is it an only option, basically, when, let's say, gangsters or not gangsters or military people or any kind of other group of people who gathers together and decides to do something? Is it the only way something can really move and function, or not?
I hope not. I mean, I'd hate to think that a mafia family is the only moral and historical model we can come up with in 2024.
Why not? Say.
Why not? Mm-hmm. Because it's very impoverished. Because it's almost uniquely about power and family. And nothing else really matters. I mean, The Godfather is a very curious film because on the one hand, of course, it's immensely appealing and all these actors give the performances of their lives and the script is great and it's, and it appeals to something very deep in us, as family does, as violence, of course, does, and as particularly violence when you think, the one side doing the violence are portrayed in these heroic, almost mythological terms. And it is a kind of myth. I mean, that's its power, and that's why I think it's survived long after lots of other movies that were popular at the time haven't. Seem dated or just don't, generations lose interest. I mean, it's normal. You can't expect, people of 19 to be interested in a film that was made, when their parents were young. It would be abnormal if there were too many of those, I think. But it's because it's a myth that it works, because myths are, in some deep sense, if not immortal, much longer lived. But, to model yourself on the Corleone family, I don't know. I can't help feeling we can do a little better than that. Maybe not a lot, but surely a little.
Speaking about myths, there is a huge debate on all the monuments to be removed, streets to be renamed, and particularly about my city, about Odessa. There is the whole discussion about decolonization. However, we were not colonized actually as a city, but it doesn't matter. And the whole thing about the new myth of Odessa, which people think is desperately needed. Can a tall myth be specifically created for some place? A totally new narrative, story, whatever, be written, or it's impossible until those people are alive who have, lived there before?
No, I don't think it's impossible. I mean, it's not going to be the way, it won't be as the new myth makers completely want it to be. That only works in very totalitarian societies and, not in quite a chaotic society like this one. You're not going to be, I mean, Maoism could impose new myth, within a few years of taking power. Even though lots of people, I'm sure, absolutely hated it. But in order to really impose a myth in that sense, you have to be willing to kill a lot of people. And I don't think the new myth makers of Odessa really want to murder a third of their population the way the Chinese did. At least I hope they don't. You have to reassure me on this when we're finished with this program. Myths are mortal, like everything else. And it's not just we human beings who are mortal. Societies are mortal. Civilizations are mortal. Myths are certainly mortal. The great American playwright Arthur Miller, mid-20th century American playwright Arthur Miller, said, an era is over when it's outgrown its myths. And so, my reading from what little I know of Odessa, I've been there a bunch of times, but I certainly wouldn't claim to know anything, is that the Novorossiya myth is dead, but what can replace it, and what? So, all right, there's no statue to, the statue to Catherine's in the museum now, and the Pushkin statue's coming down, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Personally, by the way, I'm not against that. I don't think those statues were there because Russians loved Pushkin. I think those statues of Pushkin were there to say, you belong to the Russian world, and you have every right to reject that and its artifacts. But having said that, you can't just make myths the way you make soup. It doesn't work that way. People have to. You can propose myths. Of course, you can change street names, stuff like that, and that shifts things. But it's not, and younger people remember, the next generation will remember that Pushkin Street, that what's called, Shevchenko Street used to be called Pushkin Street. That'll bother people who grew up with it as Pushkin Street, but, that's what, that time will sort that one out. But you can't, I don't think you can just make up myths or counter myths. You can destroy myths. And then, because as the science, the elementary school science class has it, nature abhors a vacuum, so something else will take its place of some kind, better or worse, who knows?
You think it will take some space by itself, or how will it happen? Because I do not see it happening for the moment, to be honest.
Well, it seems to be very difficult to imagine putting the Catherine statue back up where it was. I was fortunate enough to go to Odessa before they tore it down, or took it down rather, because it's in the museum, obviously. And I was glad to see it, because, you get some physical sense of what it must have been like. I was also in the little Pushkin museum there, where before they boxed up the statue to save it from the vandals. And you try to put yourself back 20 years and say, well, what was it like to walk up the street? And that was just part of the geography of central Odessa. Without those, something will happen, or else there'll be chaos. Look, lots of conservative thinkers have, always say, be careful about tearing down the statues, because maybe what comes next will be worse. I have no idea. Depends how the war ends, depends how the post-war is here. I don't think it's possible to know that. I also think young people are making a different culture now. It's not very dependent on books or the things that maybe people like me care about. But it's a culture, and it'll have its different, it'll it'll remake things. Again, whether for better or worse, that's not for me to say. Certainly not here.
When you are not in Ukraine, because you come and go, what are you thinking about Ukraine, and what do you miss about Ukraine? What are you remembering? I don't know.
Well, I miss my friends here. I mean, I have now made some real friends, and so I miss them, and I also miss it's not so much miss as it feels as if I belong here. I simply cannot, for all kinds of reasons, be here all the time. And I have other things I write about and other things I'm committed to doing in New York and in Europe, in Western Europe. So it's not, it's simply impossible for me to say, well, I'm going to move here for a year or two and see what happens after that. But I feel rather guilty when I'm not here, particularly when it gets rough. And I read about, the Shahids and the Kinjals and the rest, and then I feel particularly guilty. But not being here. It's much easier to be here during those things in a way. For me, I mean, I don't mean for Ukrainians, I just feel like I should be here and I can't be, so that's not a happy situation. I feel a very deep commitment to this country. How useful I can be to it is highly debatable. I'm not just being falsely modest when I say that I don't know whether what I do here, what I'm able to contribute here is of that much value. I mean, people like to meet me because I'm an amusing fellow who has lots of things to talk about. But I don't think that, that's why I've started to teach. I don't actually particularly like to teach. And I would never take a teaching job in France or in the US, which are probably the only two places they'd offer me one. But here I feel, well, that's some contribution.
You were in Balkans during the war. Now when you talk to people, I don't know, in Ukraine or in other countries, what do you think they did not understand about it? What did you want them to know about it or understand about it, and they don't?
Well, I wanted people to care, but, it's very difficult to care about people far away. It is. And particularly if you have, as it were, your own problems. Remember, Bosnia took place at the same time as Somalia. And, it would have been preposterous to ask a Somali to care about Bosnia, and it would have been preposterous to ask a Bosnian to care about Somalia. It would have been a ridiculous, pretentious falsehood. What I wanted people to know about in the Balkans was I thought Bosnia was a just war. I thought there was a just side, the Bosnian government side, and I thought there was their victimizers, the people who were trying to destroy them, and that was the Serbs, and largely the Serbs to a lesser extent, and more ambiguously the Croats. And I wanted people to know that. And so I didn't, whether I succeeded in making that understood or not, it justified my being there, because I wasn't yet a professional war guy. I was a journalist already, but I've had a couple of careers, and but I didn't write about war before Bosnia. And then after that, and the humanitarian aid world and the UN system and all that stuff that I've written about so much since, And I guess that's why I'm here, because I think this is the other just war that I have been alive for, and where I could go in a morally serious way. And in fact, but I didn't, and there are very few just wars. I mean, this is what when they gave me an honorary professorship at Kiev Mohyla, that's what I was talking about, was that just war. And so, I'm, much too old to be in war zones, but why not? But it's because because I think Ukraine is right. And that's very, very rare. And I'm a person who sees everything or almost everything in shades of gray and ambiguity, or however you want to describe it. I tend to see the feet of clay more than the beautiful, face. And I think this is an exception. So now I'm here, even though it's kind of absurd that I'm here and going to the places I go to, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it seems worth it to me. In fact, it feels sometimes like a kind of obligation. A good obligation, it's not an unwelcome obligation, but it is an obligation. And, it's very heavy. Moral obligations are very heavy, we keep wondering if you can keep holding it in your arms, or if your arms are going to just get too tired and you're going to drop it. You never know. But that's why I'm here. I wouldn't go at my age just to cover a war, even though there are wars going on now that interest me. And Sudan interests me. For example, I've spent a lot of time in Africa in my life, and Sudan interests me for all sorts of reasons. I certainly wouldn't go to the Middle East, but I find the Middle East unbearable, so I just stay away. I worked there for a while, and in Iraq. But it seems imperative to me to be here. I'm just talking for myself. I'm not a proselytizer. I think I'm not trying to convert anyone.
Tango. You spent some time in Argentina. Talk to me about tango. Does it matter at all, or is it really connected to Argentina for people who go to Argentina, or it's some separate stuff and Argentina is separate for you in the perception?
Well, tango is one of the great musical forms. And if you like, the high end of popular music, it's like jazz, or it's like, certain kinds of it's one of the great forms that are musical forms that express themselves. So, it's, in that sense, it should be interesting to everybody who is interested in music. And also in dance, because the dance is so distinct and passionate and curious, and combination of licentiousness and repression. And so, of course, I'm interested. But then, of course, I've spent, for the last 15 years, at least a month, and often quite a bit more time in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. And so for me, I think I tend to view tango more as a local would. There are these tango places. Tango is very much alive. There's even a young person, the young have their own weird electronic version. And I go to the bars, the milongas, the tango bars, now and again. I don't go as much as I used to, but I had a great friend who actually wrote a book about the milongas, who died very recently. I used to go with him all the time. But, you know, it's one of the great musical forms, and one that I'm more interested in than some of the other great popular music forms. Bolero, for example. So I'm always happy, and I listen to it all the time. I mean, I like the words. So, you know, I have all the discs of all these great figures of the tango, like Discepolo and Omero Manzi and all these characters. And, but again, I don't think I'm objective about the tango. I think I'm too much of a kind of adopted Argentine now. I don't think I see it globally. Although, you know, the tango's pretty old by now, so much so that in 1912, the future president of France, Georges Clemenceau, declared that the tango was dead. It had outlived itself. This was 1912. But I mean, I greatly admire it. And I like to watch people dance. I don't dance myself. I'm too snobbish to do something badly. And I don't do things that I do badly.
And the last one for today will be the same that I asked Judith when she was here. I asked her about the poets and poems, because we had a discussion with you and her about literature, where it was very obvious that I perceive the English language literature through the eyes of editors and interpreters of my, of the books which were there when I was a kid. And you were saying names which I never heard. So 3 most important poets for you, and 1 poem if you can recite or not. Judith actually refused. She said she doesn't remember by heart.
I don't remember many by heart, but well, there are a lot of great poets in English. I mean, poetry is a thing that's really been good in the English language for about 500 years. And it's had its ups and downs, but it's been good, and it's still good. There's still a lot of really good poets writing now in English. I don't think I'm not much for hierarchies or lists, to be honest with you. But I would say, and in my life, different poets have mattered to me more at different points.
Now, what? There's 3 ones now.
What would I read now in English? There's an Irish poet called Paula Meehan, who's quite wonderful. It's probably the best poet writing in Ireland. She's about my age, so she's not one of the newer people. And there are lots of interesting young poets in Ireland, particularly. Although the old joke about Ireland is there are 20,000 poets and 2,000 poetry readers. So, take it for what it's worth. So I think Paula Meehan would be one of a... Who else would I read? I'm trying to think of people who aren't obvious. I mean, I could name the 10 most famous poets of the last 100 years, and most of them matter to me to one degree or another. Whether it's Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot or W.H. Auden or W.B. Yeats, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the great Wallace Stevens. I mean, there is this, great tradition of English, Irish, and American poetry. But to name people who are less maybe expected, I think I don't know. It's hard for me. When I was speaking of great poets, when I was a kid, there was one of the great American poets of the middle of the 20th century was a man called Robert Lowell. And Robert Lowell was very weird guy. He was manic depressive and rather awful, but fascinating. And he used to torment me when I was a sort of brash 14-year-old with questions like, name your five Jacobean poets in order of their importance. And I would do that, but I was 14, and now I'm 72, and I don't really feel like doing it. But I read a lot of Larkin, Philip Larkin, who's a very grim, another one of the grim ones. This is not my favorite poem, but just to give you an idea of Larkin, there's a poem called This Be the Verse, which is very short, and it goes, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by men in long-tailed coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands out misery to man. It widens like a coastal shelf. Get out as quick as you can. Don't have any kids yourself. So that's not his best poem by any means. He's the best writer I know about death. There's a poem called Obad, which is about non-existence, which may be the most terrifying poem written in the English language in the last 100 years or so. But he's a brilliant poet, and that's just because I know it by heart. So if you wanted me to say something by heart, so there it is. Maybe not what you expected. Who else would be a third name besides Larkin and me? And Louise Gluck, I think, who just died, was an American poet. She won the Nobel Prize. Poetry not that long ago, shortly before she died. She's one. Those might be three names.
Okay, so then I see you in the end of January.
I'll be here.
The same room?
You can only, everyone's going to get totally bored with me, which is perfectly reasonable.
I don't get bored with you. So that's it for today.
Okay, well.